And now I will move on and kind of linking the historical sources to the gardens, to the historic garden today. I will make a presentation about pruning hooks and hedge slashers. I will talk about some different tools, and I wanted to start to just show the tools so that you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes I will talk about the sickle, and it's this tool, the traditional sickle. I hope that you can see it.
Raise it a bit higher, please.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
So here's the sickle, and I will also talk about the pruning hook. And the pruning hook, it's like a sickle on a very long handle that you can see on the left image right now. And then I will also talk about, it's a challenge because some of the tools are big, but I will also talk about this tool. It's the hedge slasher. It's a bit more than a meter long. And then I will talk about hedge shears. So when I talk about hedge shears, it's traditional manual hedge shears. So that's just because I will talk about some different tools, and I wanted to introduce them because they are important in this presentation. So, yeah, my name is Joakim Seiler, and I am head gardener at Gunnebo House outside Gothenburg in Sweden. And Gunnebo House is an 18th century estate with a strong craft profile. And I have studied hedges and lawns in my PhD project, and I have used Gunnebo House as my laboratory. And I've not been doing this completely on my own. I've been doing this together with my colleagues, and especially with the gardener Daniel Lundberg, who have contributed a lot in the craft studies. In this presentation, I will tell you about the pruning hook and about the hedge slasher. And the use of them, and also in the historic sources. So the research question in my PhD project was, one of the questions was, how did they manage these hedges in the 18th century? And this image shows the grove in the pleasure garden at Gunnebo. And another research question was, and how can we manage these hedges in historic gardens today? At this painting, we see the grove in the pleasure garden at Gunnebo House. The common Swedish word for grove is the French term bosquet. The grove is a garden element, as we have heard about by Jan Woodstra, in the pleasure garden that can be described as a stylized forest, which is usually small. Some groves are larger and similar to natural woods, and some are smaller and clearly shaped by human intervention and design. And according to Desailliers, there are several types of groves that we've heard about. Here we see the original design for the grove at Gunnebo by the architect Carl Wilhelm Karlberg. Over 200 original designs from the architect for Gunnebo has been preserved and are today invaluable sources of information, both for reconstructions of lost elements at the estate, or for managing the garden and trying to be true to the original. The groves at Gunnebo does not completely fit the categories of Desailliers, but they are closest to the category, the woods of a middle height. And I quote, "The woods of a middle height are styled of a middle height because the trees wherewith they are planted never arrive to great height of the forest trees, scarcely exceeding 30 or 40 foot high. These woods are adorned with halls, cabinets, galleries, fountains, etc. The squares are bordered with hedges and lattice work, and their alleys are handsomely kept and well gravelled, which renders them very neat and curious." End of quotation. One peculiarity with the grove at Gunnebo is that it is completely clipped at the top, as you could see in the earlier image, even if it is 5 meters wide. And this is a challenge today, and surely also it was a challenge in the 18th century. In this image, we see another grove in Sweden. It is the grove in the Royal Garden in Stockholm, as depicted in the Svecia Antiqua. And here we see a more typical design for groves in Sweden than the one at Gunnebo House. This grove consists, and I try to point it out here, we'll see if you see my marker here. It consists of neatly clipped enclosing hedges, and then inside of the hedges you have a filling of freely growing shrubs and trees. You don't have this completely clipped top. You have the neatly clipped hedges that surrounds the bosquet filling. When it comes to management, this grove is much easier than the Gunnebo one, since you don't have to clip the entire upper side of this grove. So now we will get back to the research question in this craft research. How did they manage these hedges in the 18th century? If we use the extended battery-powered hedge shears, it is possible to clip the entire top of the hedge from a scaffold, as we see in this image. But the research question was, how did they manage these hedges in the 18th century? To answer that, we have to put away the extended battery-powered hedge shears and look for other tools. The obvious tool that you think of is the traditional manual hedge shears depicted here. To trace the introduction of hedge shears into Sweden, I have compared with the development in Central Europe described in the previous research by Clemens Alexander Wimmer, the German garden historian. He states that hedges were introduced in the Renaissance garden and were mainly managed with sickles, the tool that I showed you in the beginning of my presentation with the curved edge. When the pleasure garden developed with elaborate hedge ornaments and topiary, the need for hedge shears occurred, according to Wimmer. In Germany, it was introduced by the garden author Peter Laurenberg in 1631. And in Sweden, the first record of the word häcksax, or hedge, the Swedish word for hedge shears, is by Åke Roland in 1690. So they had hedge shears in the 18th century. We know that, and they used them for clipping hedges. But when I was testing them on this very high and wide hedges at Gunnebo, I could only reach 1.54 meters, and the hedge was 5 meters wide. So they must have had other tools as well. And the search for historical tools continued in the historical sources. The search resulted in several findings, such as these images and some text sources that we will see in these international image sources. what we see in these international image sources is the use of the pruning hook to prune trees and or high hedges. So here you see this sickle-like tool with a very long handle. The pruning hook is a pruning tool with a blade in the same shape as a sickle, as I've told you, and with a long handle. It is used to clip or prune high hedges or trees. You can see images of both, so it was used both for trees and hedges. I found an early text source in Sweden, a description of what tools the royal gardener André Mollet brought with him from France to Sweden when he introduced the French garden to Sweden. Mollet brought from France, and this is a quotation, Mollet brought from France various gardening tools, among others 6 large blades with which the palisades would be pruned. In addition, sickles in crescent shape are mentioned to crop the large palisades, French shovels and spades and curved cutting knives. And this end of quotation. This is a quotation from Sten Carling that studied the source material from André Mollet. This source indicated the introduction of these tools to Sweden in 1648. The pruning hook was also found in the encyclopedia by Diderot and d'Alembert, as we see in these images. To the left, we can see the tool in the middle, and to the right, we can see a large scaffold with 3 persons. If you look closely, you can see 3 persons pruning large trees with pruning hooks, standing on the scaffold. Another source was the Swedish gardener Daniel Müller in the 19th century, who wrote the following. It is common practice, and this is a quotation again then, it is common practice to clip hedges with a large so-called hedge shear. However, the work is quicker if they are slashed with a large sharp pruning hook or hedge slasher, which is fastened at a wooden handle 3-4 feet long. By this, the sides are slashed from below upwards, but the topping is easiest performed by shears. End of quotation. We also found more contemporary source material. A film with a French gardener was found by the gardener Katarina Ottosson, who also studied this subject. And the film showed how the tool was constructed and used in heritage gardening. The French gardener constructing and using the pruning hook on the film was Gilles Lebob in the garden Champs-sur-Marne outside Paris in France. And the reconstructed wooden scaffold for clipping hedges and trees was also studied at Schönbrunn, as we can see on the other image here. So there are still some elements and traces of this old traditional craft living on. We also found a tool producer in France that still produced the pruning hooks. And we bought them and used them in our craft experiments in the garden at Gunnebo. The craft experiments in the garden consisted in following the instructions in the historical sources to learn the craft of clipping hedges with the pruning hooks. The result was that an imaginary dialogue developed between the practice in the garden and the historical sources. The practice provided information that made me understand the sources better, and the sources informed the practice. And finally, the pruning hook proved to be the answer to how they managed the high and wide hedges at Gunnebo in the 18th century. Oh, now we'll see. Yes, I hope it still works with the technicalities.
Yeah, this looks fine.
Yep.
But are you aware of the time?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
I still have a couple of minutes. Do I?
Yep.
Yeah. Good. So what about the result with the pruning hook? Regarding the time consumption compared to other tools, I must say that it was surprisingly time efficient. Otherwise, it's a general notion that all old tools and techniques and methods, they always take too much time. So that's why we don't use them anymore. But this was surprisingly time efficient, the pruning hook. Regarding the use of the body, it was more dynamic than with power tools. But it also required some strength and became heavy after some time. With power tools, the movement was more static, the movement of the body. And when it comes to the aesthetic result, the lines were pretty straight, as you can see in the left image here. It looks okay, but it was not the technical perfection that you can get with power tools. The cuts from the tool were sometimes large scars, like the one in the image to the right. So that's some of the results from trying the pruning hook in the garden. What about the hedge slasher? It is hard to divide pruning hooks from hedge slashers in the Swedish sources. But in some sources it is clear, and my research has shown that both tools have been used in Sweden historically. The hedge slasher is clearly mentioned by Anders Lundström and Daniel Müller in the 19th century. Lundström also described several tools of interest, and I quote, "Besides the before mentioned tools, several others are needed, which use one sees as redundant to describe, because that they are commonly known and their mere names shows what they should be used for, such as tree scissors, tree swords, hand saw, crooked knife, and so on." End of quotation. One late source is Fjäderhane and Arvidsson from the 1960s, who wrote that the hedges were slashed with an approximately 1 meter long saber, where after trimming was done with hedge shears. So we are in the 1960s with this tool, not only in the 17th or 18th century. During a seminar at the garden Drottningholm in the autumn 2022, a gardener at Ulriksdal described that they had been slashing the lime hedges at Ulriksdal until the 1980s, and that he was one of the persons that had been doing this. This was a breakthrough in my research. Not only the tool had existed long ago in Sweden, the tool and the practice with it in the gardens had taken place from 1648 until the 1980s. And a living practitioner had been found that can teach new generations this traditional craft and safeguard the craft as intangible cultural heritage. This is important because then we don't have to reconstruct the craft. Instead, we can learn from a tradition bearer, a living craftsperson